Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll get started in a brief couple of moments. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Laying KM Foundations for Successful and Transformative AI. My name is Madison Joronsky, and I will be your moderator. I work in our knowledge management practice here at Enterprise Knowledge, and I'm excited to be hosting this session today. Before I hand the mic over to Zach and Joe, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about this presentation and the EK webinar platform. Please note that all participant lines have been muted, but we would still love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to send it through the chat tab on the GoToWebinar control panel or tweet us at EK Consulting. We'll be answering questions at the end of this session, and if we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. Also, today's webinar will be available on demand within 24 hours after the live session via our website. We will send an email with the link following the conclusion of this webinar. Please feel free to share the link with anyone you think would be interested. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce today's speakers, Zach Wahl and Joe Hilger. Zach is our CEO at Enterprise Knowledge, and Joe is our COO. Both are eager to share how AI can harness the full spectrum of your organization's knowledge so that information can be found, used, and reused. Over to you two.
Excellent. Thanks, Madison, and thanks everybody for joining. So glad that we've got such a good crowd on the line. We're going to talk for 40 to 50 minutes. We're going to save room for questions, so please make sure that, as Madison mentioned, you do chat us some questions over the course of the time. With that, we'll dive right in. And one of the ways that we always like to start is by giving you Enterprise Knowledge's definition for knowledge management. As many of you are KM practitioners, you know this. The term KM is one that's often used and abused. It means different things to different people. So we always like to spend a minute or two framing this up properly. I promise this will be the only time that we read from a slide, but I'll do that now. Knowledge management involves the people, culture, processes, and enabling technologies necessary to capture, manage, share, and find information. So let's unpack this for a second. Let's actually talk about why we've worked hard to make this our definition. First and foremost, note the verbs: capture, manage, share, and find. We'll dig more deeply into this over the next couple slides, but the real key here is that good knowledge management is about the people, process, content, culture, and technology that allow people, that allow folks within your organization to do the things they need to be able to do to effectively share and leverage their information.
You know, an important note here is we said technology last. It's not the least important thing. It is an enabler, but it shouldn't be the driving force. We've all been involved with those systems where someone put in the greatest solution ever and they dropped it into people's laps and everyone said, this doesn't work at all. It doesn't work for me. So we really focus on those early phases about people, process, and culture to make sure that what happens is accepted. And that's how knowledge management really ends up working.
And that is such a critical point to what we're going to be talking about today, because though we list technology last, though we refer to it as a critical enabling factor, in order to really define and construct and run practical knowledge AI for your organization, technology plays a key role, and we'll be highlighting that today as well. So as we pull apart KM, as we pull apart our definition a little bit more clearly, we've already listed these: people, process, content, culture, and technology. When we're talking about people, we're talking about understanding who holds the knowledge and who needs it. We're talking about ensuring that there's the appropriate access to experts within the organization, but that from every type of user within your organization that is either a consumer or creator or manager of knowledge, that we understand who they are so that they can be mapped appropriately. From a process perspective, we know that every organization on the planet has all sorts of processes for capturing and managing and sharing their information. It's really a question of how well they're followed and how easy they are to follow. From a content perspective, this is what we lovingly refer to as stuff. When we talk about content, we're talking about your unstructured content, your files, your documents, your records, as well as your structured content, your data. And that point is really critical to how we talk about knowledge management, the fact that it is the complete spectrum from structured to unstructured information, and that the most mature organizations can map all of that together, relate it in ways that it really builds this foundation for AI.
You know, and the neat thing is, in the past few years, some of these technologies have advanced, and we're going to talk about this as we move forward, so that you really can properly integrate both structured and unstructured information. That's for a long time been the holy grail, and it's possible. And we're going to show you how as we continue talking.
Next, we talk about culture. And the idea here is that it doesn't matter how well you've made your information findable, how well you've created processes, if you don't have a culture of knowledge sharing underpinning it, if you don't have leadership support guiding it and driving it forward. It doesn't matter how good your systems are if the right knowledge isn't being captured from the right people and put into a way that is immediately actionable, that it makes sense for others to consume it. And then, again, lastly, technology. Now, we feel really strongly there's very few products that build themselves as KM tools. A mature organization is going to recognize that there is a KM suite. There are all different types of tools: content, document, records management, enterprise search, increasingly taxonomy and ontology and auto-categorization or auto-classification tools. And as we'll talk a little bit about today, knowledge graphs as well. Weaving all of these tools together is what creates your KM suite in the most mature way possible. So next, we'll talk a little bit about KM in action. And again, the key here for anybody who's trying to explain knowledge management, what we always strive to do is talk about KM without using the letters K or M. Instead, we talk about it based on these verbs, based on what your end users are striving to do, what's hard that should be easier, what they can't do at all. That begins by making it easy to create knowledge, create a new document, a digital record, but also to take the stuff that exists in one's head, their experiences, their tacit knowledge, and easily put it into a format where others can find it, where it can be maintained beyond their own life cycle within an organization. From a capture perspective, we're talking about ensuring that all of that information that's been created gets to a place where it can then be effectively managed. The idea that from a management perspective, knowledge, the natural state of knowledge is to trend it towards decrepitude. And we want to counteract that by managing it effectively, by making it more mature, more clean, and more actionable over time. That speaks to the idea of enhancement, of taking knowledge and relating it. adding tags, making it more searchable, relating it to other documents in order that you can have a complete learning and a complete experience where you're finding everything you're looking for, and even relating it to people. And Joe will speak a little bit to connect in a moment. But before we get there, we talk about finding. We talk about the idea that through all of this, we're striving to ensure that the right information can be found and discovered by the people who need it.
Yeah, when everyone talks about AI, one of the first things that comes to mind with AI is machine learning. And a lot of where that happens is in the enhanced phase. There's no way to take hundreds of thousands or millions of pieces of content and actually tag them, associate them without actually using machine learning and other tools, some level of automation to do that. So that's a critical piece of enhance. But I'm going to jump forward to connect, which is the end. When we started this company 4 or 5 years ago, we put this 6 years ago, as Zach said, we put this wheel out in place, the donut, as we call it, our action wheel. And the last piece of this was share, not connect. But what we've learned over time, especially as we're seeing this advancements in AI and the advancements of technology, is that it's not just about being able to share information with one another. It's about connecting. And when we say connecting, we talk about connecting people to content. That's the classic search and helping people find what they want. But it's also content to content. If I have two pieces of information that are related, how do I know they're related? And how do I make sure that that's seen and captured? Or if I have a cluster of information. And then lastly, connecting people to people, right? So it's not enough, we have these chatbots, we talk about automation, but the reality is at the end of the day, you want people to be able to talk to or get information out of another person. So connect is critical in the long run to making sure that this KM in action really happens.
So on the next slide, this is actually it's become quickly one of my favorite slides, even though it is likely one of the most dry in this deck. And to me, this is really the end of the conversation regarding the value of KM. I think too frequently when people say, why do we need knowledge management, they talk about the things on the left side of this screen, the KM outcomes. But where we should be framing the conversation is on the right side of the screen, the business outcomes. And what that really means is that good KM and increasingly good knowledge AI is going to result in higher productivity, less time wasted looking for information, waiting for answers, more time being spent innovating, making good decisions, acting consistently. All of this turns into higher quality, improved delivery, improved sales. And there's another big key here, the last one, and that's the idea of future readiness, which is what we're going to be talking about on the subsequent slides. The idea that knowledge management, if done correctly from the start, offers immediate business value, like we're showing here, but also increasingly lays the foundation for artificial intelligence within your organization.
Companies always want to talk about growth. Let's talk about how that happens. Typically with growth, you have to bring in new employees. How critical is it that they come in ready to go and they're adding value quickly? We've gone, 20 straight quarters with growth. We've got a real need, low unemployment. So you've got to find people and make them work, make them efficient quickly, because that's hard. And then we talk about selling. Right? Sales is no longer, here's a product, come buy it. We're talking about consultative selling now. So it's not enough to say, here's the product. You have to start helping people understand, why does this product matter? Tell a story about it. Well, that story isn't just some data and metrics about an offering. It's the information around it and why people care about it. So KM done right really does augment sales.
Excellent. So let's hit it then. What we're going to show next is what we consider to be 6 of the foundational elements for knowledge artificial intelligence within your organization. And not coincidentally, all 6 of these are often elements that we put at the beginning of a KM transformation roadmap. So here's the thesis statement. These things are good for your organization immediately. They offer immediate business value and outcomes that are going to improve how you leverage your information, how you connect your people, how you upskill your people, as Joe was just saying. but they also play a critical role in getting your organization ready to achieve knowledge AI. So let's jump in. One of the first and one of the key foundational elements is around taxonomy design. So really briefly, taxonomy design is about defining the appropriate metadata fields and then defining an appropriate taxonomy of terms, a controlled vocabulary for each of those metadata fields. So what you're basically creating is the approximation of why everybody loves Amazon, that left rail where instead of seeing every TV, you're seeing the TVs of the type, of the brand, with the feature in the price range that you're looking for. But instead of talking about TVs, we're talking about your knowledge, we're talking about your information, being able to slice it and dice it based on all of the key criteria that matter to the folks within your organization. Who did it come from? Who's it for? What type of information is it? What is it about? These are a few examples of different metadata fields, each of which can be powered by a taxonomy.
You know, we have customers say, well, why can't we let the machine figure that out? When you look at taxonomy, there's two aspects that drive it. One is making sure your taxonomy aligns with the content that you have, the content and information that you're working with, right? That's stuff, as Zach put it. But the other side of it is making sure that it's intuitive and understandable. And a machine isn't going to recognize how people understand this stuff. So you do have to spend some time starting to do that translation. You can't rely on all that information that's been written to be written in a way that's understandable. Taxonomy helps bridge that gap.
Perfect. Now, we could spend a whole hour talking about the value of taxonomy in and of itself. But to summarize it really quickly, what is that immediate value that it offers your organization? Number one is it's about that findability that we talked about. Whether somebody is a natural searcher or browser, a good taxonomy design allows them to get to what they're looking for in a straighter line. But it goes beyond findability to talk about discoverability. Once we have tagged all of our content, or even a subset of our content consistently, we're able to ensure that somebody who finds a piece of content can then discover additional pieces of content, additional stuff that can help them complete their mission, learn completely, act completely with all the right information available. There's another key to why taxonomy is immediately valuable, and that's the fact that as you go through the process of applying tags to your content, you get a much better handle on all of the content in and of itself. We'll talk more about content governance in a bit, but the real point here is that good application of taxonomy creates cleaner, more actionable content immediately. And then the last bit is that a good taxonomy design goes beyond the systems in which it's instantiated. What that means is that a good taxonomy that people understand that they can react to automatically creates an organizational vocabulary that results in better alignment of how people talk, how they ask for things, how they look for things. Now, let's move to the green box and talk about what the value of taxonomy is to AI. So the number one point here is that a key element of knowledge AI is ontologies. So an ontology is effectively a three-dimensional taxonomy, whereas taxonomies are hierarchical in nature. There can be many of them interlaced. An ontology is effectively a three-dimensional model of your knowledge, your information, your data, and how you talk about those things. It is a relationship of different entities and how they relate to one another.
It really models the way people think. And we're going to go a little later in this presentation, we're going to dive into it, but you cannot build that ontology and start to see these relationships and inferences between different entities in your organization without starting with a taxonomy.
So, here's the key. A good taxonomy is the critical building block to starting an ontology design. Whenever we get to an organization, they say, we need an ontology design. The first thing we ask is, what's the state of your taxonomy? So what are our starting points that we can leverage in order to help you progress to an ontology design? The other big key here to leveraging taxonomies is, again, going back to this idea that if you have your content already tagged with consistent taxonomy, it makes it much easier to further tag that content, to tag all of your knowledge, all of your data, with that future ontology design. Next, let's talk about content cleanup. By far, one of the least exciting, most boring things that you can do for your organization, and yet one of the most critical. What we have found through our many efforts in this field is that most organizations are maintaining 5 times more information than they actually should. What that means is that 4 out of 5 documents are out of date, wrong, obsolete, flat out incorrect based on previous orgs or previous products or systems.
So what does that mean? Let's say we build that cool chatbot or that cool AI system that's going to guide people to the right answer. We're going to build our own company, Alexa. What if the answer it takes us to is old and outdated? What's the point of the technology if the content doesn't work with it? Garbage in, garbage out.
And even before you get to those chatbots, there is, again, that immediate value. The idea that if you have good, clean content today, it means that it is easier for people to find the right thing. Rather than wading through 4 bad documents to find the one right one, again, it's a much cleaner and straighter line. Clean content also means much lower risk to your organization, especially in heavily regulated organizations. If you have one of your employees who's acting on an outdated process or based on a bad piece of old information, you are exposing your organization to risk. That risk can be minor risk, like a bad piece of advice or an inconsistent piece of advice, all the way up to a huge regulatory fine or impact. As Joe mentioned in the purple box, in order to have knowledge AI work, in order for knowledge AI to return the right answers, it has to have the right building blocks. And that is all about the quality of all of your content and the state of that content as well, which takes us to our next point, that being content types. So what's a content type? We describe content types really consisting of a few different elements. One is really around the format of the content. For every type of content you have, determining how it should look, how it should be formatted, how it should be, in a way, templated. The second thing that a content type holds is the governance around that type of content. Different types of content need to be governed more loosely or more tightly. Highly business critical, high risk information obviously needs to be governed more tightly. And so good content type design will effectively designate the workflows, the roles and responsibilities, the policies and procedures for each type of content. And then the third piece goes back to this idea of tagging, that different content types actually merit different levels of tagging, different metadata fields, different types of questions can be asked for different types of content. If you have a content that's around training videos, asking how long it is a perfectly reasonable and smart thing to ask. If you have a content type around meeting minutes, well, you might want to know if something's 5 pages or 500 pages, but how long it is not the way that you would ask.
Maybe the security of the meeting minutes. Maybe you don't want that to come out in your public website.
There you go. And so what we see with content types is that most organizations simply don't understand the types of content they have and don't yet have a clear definition for how it should look, how it should be treated, how it should be secured, how it should be tagged, how it should be shared. So that immediate value is simply making it cleaner and more consistent how you share and how you publish your information, how it looks. If your content looks more consistent, the cognitive lift on it goes down. If everybody understands how these things are formatted, it's easier to read, it's easier to understand, it's easier to act upon. And then there's also the value to AI.
Yeah, you know, as we continue to move forward and we talk about things like semantic web, and that's becoming more of a reality, having structured content, being able to use things like schema.org, right, as a way to properly tag and organize and define your content allows you not only to make your content more usable and reusable within your organization. For that content that you're making public, you're starting to follow standards that make it reusable. Google and other systems read this stuff and use it better if you've defined it in a way that uses some of these external schemas. So we're heading in a direction where content types aren't kind of optional anymore, they're mandatory. And if you're going to improve SEO, if you're going to make your content more findable and usable, you have got to take advantage of this type of structure.
Perfect. Next, we'll move on to content governance. Now, we already talked about this a little bit, but let's go into greater detail. The way that we talk about content governance is, first and foremost, understanding what is this content for, defining very clearly its value and purpose. Secondly, defining the roles and responsibilities around it. Who is responsible for doing what to ensure that this content gets to the right people in the right format, in the right place, that it looks correct, that it is trusted by the organization, but then beyond that, that it stays that way. So a lot of content governance isn't necessarily about how it gets published in the first place, though that's an important piece of it. In a way, it is more critical to ensure that the content remains the way that it should be. And that is really about defining the appropriate policies and procedures, not just for, again, how it gets created, how it gets shared in the first place, but how it continues to evolve and mature over the content life cycle of each individual piece and type of content. Now, the part that a lot of organizations miss on content governance is the last, on the bottom left. The communications, the education, and marketing. Such a critical piece of good content governance is helping your end users, helping your content owners understand the criticality of applying governance correctly and consistently. So, what's the independent value? We've already talked about this. It's about lowering the risk for the organization by ensuring that the right content gets to the right people in the right way, and that it continues to be right over time, that it continues to get better and more trusted rather than falling into disrepair. Content governance will help you avoid that thing that I mentioned earlier, that 4 out of 5 documents for many organizations, frankly, shouldn't be indexed or shouldn't be findable or leverageable in the way that they currently are presented. Then we ask, what's the longer term value? Well, in large part, it's still about the sanctity of the information, as we talked about earlier. The idea that if you are creating mechanisms that will better push content to the right people, that will better expose your content, that will, in a semi-automated fashion, publish answers or provide direction to your end users, you better ensure that the right stuff is being used to feed those answers. But there's another piece. Knowledge AI and that approach to artificial intelligence for many organizations is not a straight line. This is where oftentimes agile approaches come into play, but regardless of how you do it, you will learn things about your organizations, your people, and your knowledge that you don't know now. You will need to evolve. And part of that is about putting a governance plan in place, having a governance plan in place, so that you can quickly pivot without breaking your processes and breaking your content. Next, we talk about KM leadership. The most mature organizations in knowledge management are ones that have very clearly defined roles and responsibilities, ownership over knowledge management. It doesn't just happen naturally. Even in the most collaborative, happiest organizations, KM doesn't just happen. You have to work at it. And so defining the right roles, the right people who are empowered in the right ways to be able to really focus on building that knowledge culture, owning it, and directing the best practices around KM design, strategy, operations, implementation, and evolution is a really big key to ensure that the investment that you make in KM pays off and is sustained over time. Those organizations that have invested in KM, unless they have a strong leadership plan in place, it will fall into disrepair.
You know, and organizations, a classic organizational structure encourages silos. It's just natural. So you have to fight the silo mentality and the silo behaviors, because if you don't, you're not going to have the knowledge and information to actually build your AI solutions. And that leadership is a lot about breaking down the silos and getting information across different organizational groups so that it's more usable.
And then the question becomes, why is KM leadership critical to AI? The number one answer here is simply that if an organization chooses to jump into AI, like many of our clients have, they will often find that their initial investment in software and services doesn't pay off because the right foundation wasn't there. KM should be at the center of any AI conversation and budgeting process and planning process for all the reasons that we've already talked about. Without the right foundational elements in place, without knowing where the organization wants to be and how they want to be able to serve up their knowledge and information and data, most organizations' investments in AI will falter. And unfortunately, we've seen that all too frequently. Finally, we'll talk about the knowledge sharing culture. Now, again, this is another role of KM leadership, is to put this knowledge sharing culture in place. And, the way that we often talk about this is that there are three big impediments to having people want to share the knowledge within their organization, within their heads. The number one is that they're afraid. They're afraid of sharing something that they shouldn't share, that would get them in trouble, that would shine a light on something that they did. Number two is that they are afraid of losing their power, that they're worried that if they share their knowledge, they will become less important to the organization. And the number three reason that people don't share their knowledge is that it's hard. It's too hard in organizations. It takes too much time. It doesn't feel natural. And so part of building a knowledge sharing culture is about counteracting those two fears and one design issue. Building it up, there's a ton of different ways that you can do this. Gamification can play a role, but it's also a term that can easily be messed with if not planned correctly. That's, again, a conversation for another day, or a webinar for another day, perhaps. But really, it's about building the appropriate controls into the organization to protect, reward, support, and enable people to share their knowledge. And again, why is this important to AI? With knowledge AI, like never before, you are going to be able to relate different types of information together, ranging from your structured data to your unstructured content, your files and documents, to your tacit knowledge. The greatest power that comes from knowledge AI is being able to pull all of these things together so that your end users can finally see a complete understanding of what they can leverage. Well, you can't do that unless that knowledge has been harnessed, unless people, your experts, your learners, your content owners, have consistently and completely shared what's in their head and shared what's on their hard drives and shared what's in their emails in ways that your AI tools actually have the right inputs. Now, at this point, we're going to shift from those foundational KM elements to talk about how we define the 5 levels of knowledge AI, effectively the different levels of maturity.
And this is, we've been fortunate. We got out on the front curve on ontologies and knowledge graphs, and they're so tightly tied with AI these days in the knowledge AI space. What it's done is companies come to us all the time and say two things. I bought this tool and it's supposed to give me AI and it's not working. Or my executive or my boss called me up and said, we need to get AI in place today. And the reality is it's not that simple. And organizations that have tried to jump in it have had that, you almost see the trough of disillusionment that we're all familiar with, where, oh, this doesn't work. And that's not the case. So we put together this 5 levels of of knowledge AI as a way to help people better understand that it is a progression and it is a series of steps. And so this is kind of our maturity model to say, where are you and where are you going? And this actually helps when your boss is saying, why aren't we on AI yet? You could say, oh, we're here and this is where we're headed. So let's dive a little deeper into each of these. First level is what we call answer. And this is simple in many ways. It's not simple to do, but this is search, right? This is the ability to look for and find the information you need. Now, historically, a lot of search, there was, apparently a lot of magic in some of the tools people were buying, but they didn't really work. We've matured to a point where we can make search work. in the industry. If you know what you're doing, you can implement a search that works, that creates findable information, et cetera. And that is the first step. If you can't do that, and by the way, you can't do it without all the work we've talked about before, then you're not going to move all the way down to the infer or advise phase, because that's just, these things build on each other, and it's just not going to happen. So, search, basic query and response, potentially a simple chatbot, nothing too complex. That's that phase one, and that's a great start. Let's talk next about recommend. How many people remember in the early days of Amazon when you'd buy something for a friend as a gift, for example, and then for the next few months, every time you ordered something, it would recommend something relevant to that gift that you could care less about. We've all seen that, and it's not just Amazon, right? Amazon's gotten very good at this. It's a lot of these shopping models. The idea of being able to recommend information was critical, but the problem a lot of people ran into is it was typically based on the order or the transaction and the information that it was associated with. What it lacked was an understanding of the individual. So it was recommending something to an individual without really knowing who that individual was or what they cared about. The neat thing now is we're building knowledge graphs and able to integrate people and really connect all this information together, is that the ability to recommend meaningful things is now no longer just reliant upon a transaction or a simple mathematical or statistical calculation of this content is similar to this. You can actually start to relate it to people. So when we talk about knowledge AI and recommend, we're not talking about the old school, this is tagged the same as this and let's show this. We're talking about starting to build your knowledge graph and your information source so that you know the person you're talking to. Next up, combine. This is where it gets exciting. We have silos of information. You have systems everywhere. And all of that is good information, but it's not good if you can't pull it together, right? So you have Salesforce that tells you about your customers and your interactions with your customers, right? You have an accounting system that tells you kind of what you're selling and what you're working with, maybe an inventory system, all these different tools. And how do you bring this together? This is, in a way, it's starting to talk about that mixture of content and data as well. How do we take all of that and pull it together as one thing?
Yeah, so many of you may have heard terms like learning at the point of need. We also talk about knowledge at the point of need. At different times, you might ask the same question but want a different type of answer. Sometimes you want the 2-sentence, really quick, easy answer. Sometimes you want the soup to nuts, 300-page, super detailed answer. Sometimes you want the opinionated answer from the experts in your organization. And sometimes you want the video that doesn't just give you the answer, but gives you all of the ways to learn how to answer it better the next time. This whole idea is about giving the organization the ability to combine all of these different types of knowledge, these content types, into a cohesive, actionable whole so that the end user has the ability to choose the type of answer that meets the knowledge at the point of need.
You know, and along these lines, we built what we called a semantic hub for one of our customers that truly implements this logic. We've taken information from, 10 or 15 different data sources, mixed it all together in a soup, but we've tagged it, we've organized it, we've put it inside of a knowledge graph to where we can see how these things are related. And that allows us to combine the information and give back results of different forms and fashions at that point of need. Really powerful, but as you can imagine, if you're combining old, stale, outdated information, that's a problem. That's why all this work has to be done up front to move to this combined level. And this is a pretty advanced piece. So let's move beyond combined. So to date, we've always been talking about serving up the information you've put together. And that's great. But how do we go a step beyond? When we talk about artificial intelligence, what we have to do is be able to make inferences. So because this piece of information is based on this piece of information or is related to it, and this piece of information has this attribute about it, then the thing I'm looking at might have that same attribute. And I'll give you an example. Working with some international organizations that do projects around the world, if they're doing a project or work in one country, right, they may have information about how that's best done associated with that country. A system that does inference might say, this country that we're talking about has the same GDP as this other country, or they're in the same kind of territorial area, or possibly the same distance from the equator. And so what I've learned from country A is relevant to what I'm doing in country B. And that's really, that's where you're starting to look and people are going, wow, we're creating knowledge and information we didn't know we have. Infer is one of those first steps where we're creating information, not just taking in and sharing it back.
And there's a critical component to this. Joe mentioned earlier the idea of silos within an organization. At this level, those silos aren't being burnt down based on the hard work of individuals. They are being burnt down by your knowledge AI. A tool, an ontology, a system that can look across all of your knowledge can actually disregard things like geography or division and instead focus on the likeness of the information. Maybe it's from a different place, maybe it's from a different project, maybe it's from a different time, maybe it's even on a different subject. But if there are similarities between it, the tools, if designed correctly, can actually do a better and more complete job of finding that likeness than a whole team of humans could.
And you see this with Google, with Alexa. This is where these tools are at the infer state. And by the way, those organizations have spent millions and millions of dollars to get there. This isn't easy. Now, they're working with a bigger set of information. More targeted, you can do this more cheaply, but this is where I think the leaders in the economy are today. So let's move one step further. Advise. I like what Zach said earlier about getting people the information they want at the point of need. That all assumes, however, that they know to ask for it, right? We're in a world right now of information overload. I bet while on this call, every one of us got 20 emails and some texts and some Slack messages, et cetera. And then you probably got news alerts, and there's news all the time these days, right? You're just getting bombarded with information. Wouldn't it be nice if systems would pull that information together, take out the meaningful stuff, recognize who you are and what you're doing at that moment, and get you the information you need when you need it to make good decisions, right? This is the future. So it's not just give me a chatbot, give me a cool engine that I can ask questions to NLP and answer them, right? This is about taking all this information we get every day and getting the right information to us at the right time, at the point of need, just exactly what we need. And this is where the leading companies in this industry are headed. This is what Google wants to do. This is why Alexa and Google Home, this is why they're trying to create these smart tools in homes, because they want to be able to tell you what you need when you need it.
Yeah, now I want to reiterate something Joe said, because I think it is so critical to the most mature knowledge AI. And that is the fact that in most organizations, you only get the thing when you know to ask for it. But at this point, we can design these systems based on your other behaviors, based on the calendar invites that you're booking, based on the people that you're looking up, based on the emails that you're sending. All of that can effectively feed a tool that can then advise you on the knowledge that you're lacking, that you're missing, that you're not seeing, that would be critical to you being able to perform more effectively.
Great. So let's talk about how we do this. How do we get there? And of course, here's a real easy thing. So all you have to do is take all your information, drop it in an ontology knowledge graph, and bang, you've got artificial intelligence.
Boom, done.
That was easy. So no more need to listen. You're done with the webinar. We're there. Not that easy, as I'm sure you all know. But having said that, these are the tools that enable this. There's a reason that Google is betting search on on ontologies and knowledge graphs, right? There's a reason that everything you do in LinkedIn is built on a knowledge graph. There's a reason that Gardner talks in the data world about the most important advancements on data in data management are around graph databases. It's because this idea of knowledge graphs and ontologies and starting to model information the way we actually think, this is what's going to enable artificial intelligence. And frankly, it's just a game changer.
Now, the key here is, I think too frequently organizations are still talking about AI as the thing they're going to do next year or the year after. And I hope that you've gotten the point at this point that all of this is real today. These are the building blocks, these are the systems, these are the designs, but this is real stuff that's getting done within organizations right now.
So let's dive in. What is a knowledge graph? If you go Google this, you'll see actually we've done our best to put this in as businessy terms as possible. What a knowledge graph is, though you'll see this on the web. Though you'll see this mixed in with you'll see this mixed in with a lot of very academic descriptions. And I think the easiest way to think about it is whenever we talk about people, places, or things, right, they relate to each other. When I think of someone I know, I usually think of them in relation to something else that I know or someone that I met. So a knowledge graph is that idea of capturing and modeling the things and the relationships between those things so that we can start to store information in the same way we think about information. So let's go a little deeper. How do we build one of these things? How does this happen? And it starts with a lot of content sources. The information you need, anywhere. And this internally, you can see things like SharePoint, Salesforce, Drupal for your public site, all of these different types of tools. All of these are things you want to be able to mix together. That's that soup you put together that you can then use to start pulling and defining information. And you'll notice right next to that is that taxonomy. We talked about this. If you don't have a way to categorize information in a way that makes intuitive sense to people that look for information, the rest of this doesn't work. It doesn't take. We talked about likeness. One way to measure likeness is to say that those taxonomy elements in my ontology entities are similar, right? That inference isn't possible without some level of consistency in describing things, and that consistency in describing things needs to be done in a way that's usable and understandable to the people that work with it, and hence the taxonomy. Then we move on to your ontology and your graph database. And I love the term. You hear all us techies talk about triple stores. It sounds so complex and so tricky. If you look at it, a triple store is I'm storing three pieces of information: a subject, a predicate, right, and an object. So I've got subject, verb, object. And you can see examples here on this slide. So project A has title A. Person B is managing project A. This is how we do our own internal ontology to understand ourselves. The neat thing about this, why a triple store is such a great way to store and make information accessible, is because this is how we speak, right? We speak subject, verb, object. And if we're storing information that way, it makes NLP, natural language processing, and natural language querying that much easier because it just ties together. So as you start to pull this together, you get this great knowledge graph. And that's the piece behind the system that lets us integrate that structured and unstructured information, but not just tag it, which gives descriptions and attributes about each piece of information, but taking a step further to describe how they relate to one another. So let's move on and just kind of say, what are all these things? What are these benefits of knowledge graphs? first and foremost, I can start to understand context. It's not just about the information I'm seeing, it's about how it relates to other information. Advising, combining, inferring information, all those things we talked about. If you don't understand the context of what you're looking at, you can't do the magic things with it that we talk about. So that knowledge graph, through the triple store, through this is related to this in this way, allows you to better understand not just what you're looking at, but how it fits in with other things. Next up, and we talked about this, natural language search. We were doing a project for a large organization that was looking for better ways for their executives to get information out of their large data lake. And they said, we've got all this stuff, but, and we've pulled it together, so we have a data lake, but people can't find what they want. Well, what we did is we used a knowledge graph, we used an ontology to start to relate all the different data elements so that you could start to see how they came together. And then they said, that's great, but now we want the Alexa experience to ask for reports. So we said, not a problem, because the way this is stored, when you ask subject, predicate, object, when you go after that triple store, you're asking for it in the same way we've already stored it, and it made it real easy. We dropped a little Amazon Lex and a few things. I'm going to make this sound easy. It's not incredibly simple, but once you've got the graph in place, our team moved from a well-done ontology and graph to natural language queries in a couple weeks.
Yeah, there's another example here of how KM, and in this case taxonomy, is a great foundational element to AI. So Joe just described natural language search. There are any number of off-the-shelf elements that basically have plain language that we'll be able to understand and really infer. But that doesn't speak to your own corporate knowledge. You have acronyms, you have terms, you have phrases that you use differently and internally. And a good early taxonomy design project isn't just going to define your preferred terms, your core terminology. It will also define your thesaurus, your synonyms, your non-preferred terms. And all of that should be building blocks for your future NLP.
Yeah. So let's talk about merging that structured and unstructured information next. Let's go back to our triple. I've got this report, and I've got maybe a data file. And wouldn't it be interesting when we do this right, this data file, right, so data file A supports, that's my predicate, the report that I produced. So now all of a sudden I can tie this together, right? So now it's very easy to take structured and unstructured information and make it one. And of course, that leads to aggregation. So by tying all these different disparate things together, and not just tying them together, but explaining how they're tied together, that's that verb, that action, that predicate, it allows you to quickly pull this and make an aggregated source of all these different data sources.
And let's remember, too, that when we talk about aggregation, your data sources include your people. So Joe spoke early on about the importance of connecting and the ability to traverse your content to find the right people within the organization. When we're talking about aggregation, we're not just talking about aggregating your content, your data, your structured and your unstructured information, your internal and your external information, your different content types. We're talking about all of that and your people. And so the most mature organizations are going to enable AI not just to direct the right information to people, but also direct the right people to people. And the really mature organizations can also relate this to their HR systems, their recruiting systems. You can effectively identify gaps in your knowledge before they exist and ensure that you are training the right people, upskilling the right people, hiring the right people for your future projects and your future needs, not just your reactionary needs.
So how do we get started? Of course, we'd like you to call us, but that's not always the case. You can do a lot of this on your own. So let's talk about how you go. The first step is you have to start educating people on what we just talked about. If people don't understand these foundational elements and what needs to be done, the rest of the project will be a failure. You're building something on a faulty foundation. Once they understand that, and they understand that AI isn't something that happens magically, that you buy out of the box, then you can start to get AI in place. The next thing is AI can be used in thousands of different places. We actually were working with an organization that needed to prioritize their AI needs. And a lot of that was going out and saying, what are those business cases where we can use this? And let's pick one to be successful, right? Let's not try to boil the ocean, because that doesn't usually work. In fact, it never works. So pick those business cases where it makes the most sense and where you have the best content and information to make it successful. Get one win and then get another win, right? And slowly build on it. That's how AI really happens at an organization. And then next up, all this talk, you've got inventory. You've got to know what you have to work with, because if you're trying to do some magic AI and you don't have the content or information behind it, good luck. It won't happen. And then, as we said earlier, start small. Don't go too big. Get that first pilot in place, right? Get momentum. Once it works in one place, you can do better and better, and you learn along the way. The worst thing you can do is launch something that isn't ready. And so to launch something that's successful, launch it small, launch it targeted, and then learn, and the next time you'll be better, and the next time you'll be better. And by the time you do the last or the biggest piece, you're there.
So if we go back to our building blocks, Joe talked about ontology and knowledge graphs. And the idea with an ontology is that it is this relationship of all the entities, all of the different ways that things relate to each other. But as we say, start small and then grow. It is okay to not have a complete ontology in your first iteration. And equally, knowledge graphs at the end of the day could be the index of all of your data and all of your content and all of your people. But you can focus on specific repositories first and then build from there. So all of this is about iteration, proving something out, testing it, and moving beyond it. At this point, we've got a couple minutes left for questions. Madison, has anybody been asking anything here?
Yes, we have one question. How do I know where to start with KM if I want to take advantage of AI?
Yeah, great. So this really goes back to those 6 foundational elements that we talked about. When we basically broke these out: taxonomy, content cleanup, content types, content governance, KM leadership, and knowledge sharing culture. If we were to prioritize those further, the 3 that we often recommend, really regardless of what else, are taxonomy, content typing, and content cleanups. The reason being that those are the most critical structural elements that can serve as requirements definition, business case definition, and get the right stuff ready to be harnessed by AI. Other questions? Do we have time for one more, maybe?
We do. What are some of the most common business cases people are pursuing now?
Yeah. I'll start this off, Joe, and then I bet you've got a couple others. But I think one that we've been alluding a lot to is the idea of connecting both your content and your people. So a lot of times organizations, especially geographically distributed, large global organizations, are sharing knowledge socially. They're happy to share it with people that they know, but they don't know who to ask for what they don't know. And so building structures that allow people to ask a system, self-serve when needed, but also get guideposts to the right people, the right expertise within the organization is one we're seeing a lot of.
Yeah, the other thing we're finding is building all these companies that have built these data lakes are finding that they have a lake, but they can't get to the information they need. So creating these knowledge graphs, putting these structure that helps define what you actually have in that lake allows you to start producing reports that are things that executives can get at when they need it. The other story for this is starting to create some of those chatbots or even more dynamic back and forth discussions. We see a lot of that where, you can build a chatbot pretty simple, but what happens when someone wants to have a discussion, and how can you do that in a meaningful way? So helping the service center and support side of the house is an easy add for that.
Excellent. And with that, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call. As Madison said earlier, you'll be receiving a link to the recorded version of this. We hope that you choose to share it with your friends and colleagues. If we didn't get to your question, we'll also be following up with those. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.